actually capture Jerusalem in the year 1099 and managed to hold it for about 100 years. It's under the control of Christian kings and the church. Questions on the Crusades. I don't want to get bogged down in Crusades too long, but it sort of illustrates some of what was going on. The result of the Crusades was there was a lot more travel going on. You also have technology is enabling shipbuilding, people to travel farther, road building. Actually, the Romans had already had good roads, but you have more and more international travel that's happening, more and more commerce and international commerce. Early in the Middle Ages, it was everybody with his own vegetable patch and his own chickens and pig probably trying to survive, right? But you see the growth of international trade, and along with that, you have the rise of cities, because cities grew up around these trading hubs, and so you have kind of the growth of cities. Even in ancient times, even cities like Rome were not very big cities, like anything like what we think of today. So there's a rising middle class, mostly made up of new wealth that's acquired by merchants and traders, maybe people who would have just been peasants before, who were just doing sustainable agriculture or their own, providing for their own food, basically. So these are some of the results of the Crusades. The papacy reaches its peak power around 1200. The Pope is actually choosing who the emperor will be at this point. The emperor is sort of a figurative title, because he doesn't really have control. He doesn't have the technology to actually control all of these areas. You still have these little fiefdoms and kingdoms all over the place, but he's usually thought to be the guy with the biggest control and the biggest amount of influence over the widest area. So the Pope's, this high level of papal power doesn't actually last too long, just a couple of centuries, really. Okay, thoughts about that, or questions, or is this going too fast? Is this confusing? I want us to think a little bit about, again, so that this isn't just disconnected, theoretical, ancient history that has nothing to do with us. I do want us to think a little bit about this idea of Christendom, of uniting state and church, uniting the empire and the church. Again, we've talked about, I think you guys understand this really well now. When the empire caved in, the church stepped up. It began caring. It was the primary institution caring for the well-being of people, not just in a spiritual sense, but also caring for people's physical needs and earthly affairs and earthly organization of society. Can we think of any analogies today to this situation? That's really good. I read reports that the main institutions providing on-the-ground help and care were churches, right? Yeah. In one sense, this is, again, we've talked about the church doesn't just have a political plan. The church is a political institution in the sense that it's always, if it's being faithful, if it's reading James, it's going to be helping its neighbors, right? And that is a political act, right? To help your neighbor. It's something, again, politics defined as things that people do together in common, not your private hobby of stamp collecting or bird watching. It's politics are things that people do together, right? So the church is always going to be inherently political, and that if it's functioning how it's supposed to function, it's always going to be concerned about its neighbors, right? Whether or not that means running the military and calling the shots on international trade and international, that's a separate issue. But the church is always going to have some kind of function where it cares about people's earthly goods. Right? Jeremiah 29 is a political kind of passage. Yeah, Lynn.
The churches were responsible for the hospitals in the years past.
The hospitals were invented by the church in the, I think, 500s, 600s. Yeah. Hospitals were invented by the church. Orphanages were invented by the church. All of these things, all of these social well-being institutions you can trace back to the church in this period. Yeah.
It's also more complicated today because there's a lot of expectation the government's going to step in and meet the needs that FEMA is supposed to be the one that responds to a disaster.
Right.
It's hard to navigate who's responsible
Yeah.
for what.
So the thing that's really strange and hard to it's hard for me to get my mind around is, in one sense, societies took on the value system of the church, and so they started doing these things. And so then the church is like, okay, do we pull back and let earthly governments do? There's this weird, like, what's our role? What's your role? It's actually the legacy that we live in, where our governments do have social welfare safety nets. That's actually a legacy of Christendom. It's downstream from Christendom. You don't see it in cultures that did not have a Christian, that didn't have an interaction with Christianity and with the teaching of Jesus.
This is something, being a baby boomer, then my history goes clear back before World War II. So in that time of World War II, under, I believe, because I've been told, Franklin D. Roosevelt incorporated Social Security. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. But back then, that it had to be an issue in the church, was it not?
Oh, a point of discussion.
The government.
Yeah, I'm sure.
What the church was, because I heard it from that era.
I'm sure it was a point of discussion. Yeah, I don't know what those discussions were like in the 30s with the New Deal. I guess I don't know that part of history.
Prior to that, but I did hear conversations about that from people that were even before the World War II.
Right. Deb, were you going to say something back?
Oh, it's kind of been said, but just, thinking even of missionaries, that the church is sending out too. If we look at it like in Africa, people are going there to help get clean water, in the poor, care for the needs. And I think if the church didn't do that, I don't know how many would do that. They just let them be poor. They would just let them not.
Again, in February, or the last 2 Februaries, we've taken a group of physicians and farmers from this church, and we've gone to the poorest part of Kenya, which has no medical care, and we've given medical clinics in these communities. They do not get any other medical care other than what the church is going and doing. The farmers who are going out there, they're helping them develop agricultural. These are political activities that we're used to the state doing in America because there's a legacy of Christianity, right? But you're absolutely right. But when we talked about Newton and Susan Hamlin, who are 30 years in Papua New Guinea, and you're taking the gospel, and the gospel, when it has an impact, this tribe stops trying to kill that tribe. Right? That's a political thing. If people stop trying to kill each other, and they make peace because they believe in the gospel, that's a political situation that's downstream from the gospel, right?
Well, even now, nationwide, the only resources, the majority in other states, the only resources people can find for counselors that
Mhm.
There's churches.
Right, right.
And so,
Or nonprofit Christian organizations, yeah.
nonprofit Christians mostly, because then they have a body of Christ. But
Right,
and it's funny how slowly as the state takes over,
yeah,
as we know, it becomes more about
Right.
receiving money than about providing
Right.
equitable information and help. And so
right,
there's obviously a correlation, like the state's like, I'm going to take this over
right.
just so I can tax you first.
And that's a complicated thing. Like, to one extent, we want the society to grow a conscience that reflects the imago Dei, the image of God in people, right? But then if you detach that from its roots, from its Christian roots, which is what I think we have more in secular society, then it goes off into all kinds of other crazy directions because it's lost connection with its roots, right? We'll talk quite a bit more about that this morning. So,
I think the power struggle is really interesting too, that both the state nor the church can handle power. Cited and I think we're still struggling with that.
and I don't think that tension is ever going to go away as long as we. And if we get it perfectly figured out to the perfect system, and then we install human beings running it, it's going to go wrong at some point, right?
So realizing that and how even in elections, I think there's a tendency of elections are a power pool, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're trying to figure out who will have the most influence
Right,
in order to tip it to the direction that you feel like
right,
it should go.
right,
This is really strictly a power.
right. Which is one of the reasons why Christians ought to really care about elections and politics and who's, right? Because it does matter, right? Who's in charge of.
But the trust in that is that there's fallacy in that because clearly never is perfect, right?
Right, right. Our leaders will never be perfect. We'll never have a leader who has 100% perfect policies, probably. Yeah. So it's messy, but the messiness isn't permission for us to disengage from the process, right? Okay, again, there's temptations both to the church and to society from this relationship. Power does lead to corruption. Okay. How do we view separation of church and state, right? These are some of the same questions, like what extent should they be wedded together? To what extent should they be separated? We'll talk about this more when we get into the history of the founding of America and Christianity in the American state. We're already talking through these questions, but what should our relationship as Christians and as the church, what should our relationship to the state look like, both at a national level and at a local level and at a state level? Any thoughts on this?
Well, back to your statement of power does lead to corruption. So I think in our society, you look out, and there is a trend right now that you just topple whoever has power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a sense of that over the last number of years.
Right. We're gonna talk about that directly here in just a little bit. That today, this is the fancy word for this is postmodernism, but the belief that there's nothing but power and there is no truth, there's only power. And that's a disastrous idea for running any civilization. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. So it's during this period, 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, you have the rise of the modern, something that looks more like our modern nations. What we have as modern nations today didn't really exist before this period because you had more small kings with their little 10 square mile kingdoms, right? But with some of this is increase in technological progress to where a king is able, has the capacity to control more area and to consolidate their power. So instead of just having local warlords, you have kings that can amass much larger armies. Agriculture is getting better, so you don't really have cities without agriculture, because unless you can produce enough grain to feed these people in the cities who aren't growing their own grain, right? It doesn't really work. So part of these are agricultural increases in agricultural technology. But as you can imagine, the rise of these kings who have larger territories and more power, they start bumping into conflicts with the power of the church. This is sort of during this period that you see modern nation states emerging more and more instead of just localities. And often these kings and these nations and their goals, again, they rival the goals of the church and crash into each other. So as we said, there's a new growing middle class, merchants and traders who are generally allied to the kings, to the political power, because they want stability for the free flow of trade and commerce and good roads, and that's not that different from today. Also, this seemed like something from the ancient past, but it's not anymore. With the free flow of goods and people, you have diseases and contagions that are spreading around the globe. You also have more and more of these nations that are colliding with each other. The 100 Years' War between England and France. With the increase of travel, you have, like we said, bacteria introduced to new areas. The bubonic plague, or the Black Death, hits Europe in 1350. By some estimates, killed a third of Europe, which created a lot of social instability. The power of the political power of the popes begins to decline as the political power of the kings is rising and growing. You get some really kind of ugly politics between kings and popes. The King of France, who's one of the most powerful kings in Europe at this point, he moves the papacy to France for its protection, really so he can keep his thumb on it. This is referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, where this is from 1309 to 1377, where the Pope is basically a puppet of the French kings. You have what's called the Great Schism of the papacy, where you have actually rival people claiming to be Pope, 2 and often 3 people at one time, all claiming to be the legitimate Pope. And so you can imagine how that sort of leads to a decrease in legitimacy of the office, right? You have a lot of ongoing corruption, and it just is kind of a lot of ugliness during this time period, which is going to eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation, which we won't get to that this week, I'm sure. But so it seems like we've said a lot of negative things about Christendom, about this relationship, this marriage between church and state in the Middle Ages, right? But I want to give at least 1.5 cheers or 2 cheers for Christendom for a little while here. So many of the political fruits that we enjoy today, the good things of our system, actually are rooted back in Christendom. There's a myth among modern people, modern secular people, our people, I don't mean people in our church, but in our society, that the Middle Ages were the Dark Ages, and it was just a time of nothing but church corruption and nothing but darkness and ignorance, and life was nasty, brutish, and short. You've all heard that phrase. And that there's nothing good from it, and that light came to the world in the 1700s under the Enlightenment, when we finally threw off all of that superstition, and we threw off all the church, and we threw off all the darkness, and we got the clear, pure light of reason. And that's now what we have as secular light and the word enlightenment. We'll get to that in a little bit, but that now we just threw all that stuff off because it was nothing but darkness and superstition. And I want to push back pretty strongly against that narrative. I think historically that's a false narrative. It's just not true. If you study history, it was the church that was the only thing that preserved knowledge through this period of social instability. And yeah, this modern myth that's very widespread among educated people today, that they're not educated well enough. I would argue. This myth that secular, enlightened, rational political systems arose because they were in complete contrast to the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, that there's something brand new out of the Enlightenment period of the 1700s. I want to argue, and I think if you understand history, it's really easy to make this case. It's a very strong case that the essential blessings that we have in our democratic systems did not emerge in the 1700s Enlightenment, when most modern people think incorrectly that democracy was born. In fact, all of these things which we value and cherish all come from the Middle Ages or earlier, the patristic era, before 500 AD. So let me give you some examples. You understand the argument we're making here? Does it make sense? So let me give you some examples of things that we value and cherish today in our political system that did not originate in the 1700s, as we're often told, but originated much earlier. So this whole idea, Pastor Zeke was talking about this morning, right? The idea that all human life is valuable, has inherent dignity because we're all made in the image of God. That's not an idea that started in the 1700s. That's an idea that starts in Genesis 1 and 2, right? And that's an idea that you really only see in ancient times in the nation of Israel and the people of God in the Old Testament. And then Jesus' teaching, of course, is very much is not opposed to the Old Testament. He's the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, right? And so Jesus, in teaching, again, the dignity of the human being, the dignity of all life, whether it's weak or strong, this is an idea that's rooted in Christianity specifically, and you do not see it. You do not see it in other cultures that were not impacted by the gospel. You go to India and Hinduism, you have the caste system, which is just brutal to human beings, right? You system after system. You could go to the Aztecs, you could go to the Sioux, you could go to the... Human life was not valuable, the Romans, the Greek. Human life was not valuable. Of course, it was valuable, but it wasn't recognized as valuable outside of the teachings of the Old Testament, outside of the teachings of Jesus. We live in the fruit of the impact that the gospel has had, the teachings of Jesus have had on our Western society, and not just anywhere it touches, right? Does that make sense? So one thing that became really important to work out in the Middle Ages, and this was early Middle Ages, is to work out law. This is going to sound, I'm going to try to make this as concrete and present as possible. in ancient times, what determined the law in ancient societies? Take a guess. Whatever the king feels like doing, right? The will of the king, that establishes the law of the land, right? That's not that hard to understand, right? In many places you can go to in the world, go to North Korea. What's the law of North Korea? Whatever Kim Jong-il wants it to be, right? Okay, so what Christianity was working out is downstream from the teachings of Jesus and from the Old Testament too, is that because there is a universal law of God, because that's a fact, that we can have human law that recognizes that is more powerful or that is more valid than the arbitrary will of whoever happens to be in power. Does that make sense? So rule of law was a very important Christian idea, worked out often through the Middle Ages, and only possible because God has a supreme law, right? So a human law that can be oriented to the law of God, right? Because God's law is grounded in eternal realities, things about the created order of the universe, right? We talk about if you go against the grain of the universe, you're going to get splinters, right? There is a grain to the universe, a created grain that God created into it. And so it is possible to make universal human laws based on God's created order. Not the arbitrary will of the king, or modern times, we don't think of the arbitrary will of the king, we think more of the arbitrary will of the electorate. We'll get more into that in a second. Does this make sense? These are legacies, not of the 1700s. These are legacies of the history of church engagement with society. So in the Middle Ages, they worked out things like just war theory, that even war should operate under rules, right? I can do this, I cannot. I shouldn't drop poison on civilian populations, right? It doesn't mean that people don't break these laws, but they worked out theories of law, even at an international level, even covering things such as war. Not all is fair in love and war, right? The idea of limited government. So if you're the emperor of Rome, do you believe in limited government? No. You believe in unlimited ability to do whatever in Hades you want to do, right? So this idea of limited government grew out of Christendom, the fact that the king could be limited by the law of God, or that the law of the state, of the nation, is actually accountable to the higher law of God. Because human nations are temporal, that is, they're only here for a limited amount of time. They're not divine, they're not eternal, that Christ and the law of God have the ultimate final authority, that all human states are answerable and accountable to that. Does that mean they always answer? Do they always consider themselves accountable? No, they don't. But this ideal out there that they need to aim for this was a new idea worked out in Christendom by the theologians of the church. Does this make sense? Continuing with some of these examples, the idea that the king is under the law. So we told these true stories. You remember Ambrose who called out the emperor Theodosius for slaughtering the 7,000 people, and he's like, you can't do that. And they butted heads, but nobody would have challenged the emperor like that before from a theological. He's saying, you are not honoring the law of God, so you're out of line. Now, the emperor could have killed him. That very likely could have happened. But just this idea was new in the world, that the king needs to answer to a law higher than himself. Same thing was true with, I think we talked last week about Gregory the Seventh, who was the Pope at the time, and Henry the Fourth, who was the emperor, that you can't just do whatever you want. You are actually answerable to the higher law of God. These were new ideas in society, right? Does this make sense? So this is, the Latin phrase was, lex rex, not rex lex. So the law is king, not the king is law. Right? If you live in North Korea, the king is the law. Right? If you live under a just system, the law is king over the king. Does that make sense? These were ideas that did not exist in ancient civilizations that had not been touched by Christianity, that still don't exist today in societies that have not been impacted by Christianity. This idea that the office is more important than the person who holds the office, right? So you can remove the person who's in the office and still honor and respect the office, because this is a product of law rather than the triumph of the personality of the big man. Does that make sense? These values and commitments that we hold dear today, even though we don't know why, they did not exist in earthly governments before the triumph of Christ. And in fact, many places in the world at this moment, they do not exist. Neither will these values and commitments survive the collapse of Christianity in the West or anywhere else. If you cut loose, if you cut the tree from its roots, it's a cut flower, right? It's not going to live very long, right? So if nations in the West or anywhere else, if they forget the reasons why they originally signed on to these values, they're not going to be able to maintain them cut loose from their roots. Does that make sense? Part of the Enlightenment was the attempt to keep these values while cutting them free of their Christian roots. And we're now seeing that doesn't actually work. It's not actually sustainable. People are calling into question a lot of these values that we've held dear as Americans, as Westerners, that are distinctly, uniquely Christian commitments and Christian contributions to society. I realize this would be controversial in a lot of settings, in academic settings in particular, but I think it is very easy to make a clear, compelling case from history. There's just a simple historical fact. And again, these ideas are not distinctly Western. That they will work anywhere because they're true of the universe, the created order that God has made, right? But they don't work very well. You can go into Iraq and try to bomb them into rationality. It's not going to work if they don't have the Christian substrata, the actual belief in these things, right? You're not going to bomb people into rationality and Enlightenment thinking. Does that make sense? So modern Western states. So there's been a movement in modern Western states. Think of the Soviet Union. Think of communist China. Think of these totalitarian states. Think of Nazi Germany. To claim total allegiance from their people. These are states that have overstepped their bounds. The state is not supposed to be able to claim absolute allegiance from its citizens because their higher allegiance is owed to God, not to the state. Does that make sense? modern democracy, it didn't come from nowhere. It grew out of the soil specifically of Christendom. So that's why I'm trying to give 2 cheers for Christendom, because it is many of the good fruits that we enjoy come from the things they were trying to work out, the implications of the gospel in society that they were trying to work out. You don't, I would argue, we relativism is the idea that your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth, and one culture is just as good as the next. I would argue you don't see these values and commitments growing out of Muslim societies. You don't see them growing out of Buddhist or Hindu societies, because they are distinctly Christian ideas. They will work in they will work in these societies if the gospel impacts them to the point where enough people believe in them and implement them, but they don't arise out of that soil. I realize that's a really unpopular thing to say, but do the go observe, and I think it bears up. So this is a lot of information. Thoughts? We should probably pause for a minute and kind of process some of this.
Nathan, if somebody wants to spend some time on some of these ideas of growing out Christianity, I would recommend a guy named Vishal, who's an Indian.
What's the name?
Vishal.
Okay.
Vishal.
Okay.
He's an Indian philosopher from the country of India, whose interaction has been all his life, obviously, in India. He's been around Muslim, Hindu, Christian culture. And it's, the book I would first of all recommend is I can't think of the subtitle, but I can't think of the title, but the subtitle is The Book That Changed Your World, That Built Your World. And it's essentially how biblical things develop Western civilization. It runs along the same themes of what you were talking about here, that we take for granted. He's done that in terms of the good of the community, and another name I don't have, where he discusses the fact that when morality goes in a community, then government increases.
Right.
And the cost of things increases.
Breakdown in order, the government has to try to seize more power. Yeah.
So, I found him very credible, partly because he wasn't a Western culture guy talking about it. And actually, the title is The Book That Made Your World. The subtitle is How the Bible Created the Soul of Western Civilization.
Yeah, that's great. If you want to read a book that's been published in the last 5 years and has made a huge splash, it's the Tom Holland book called Dominion. He started writing it not as a Christian, as a secular agnostic, but I think he's on the verge of becoming a Christian now, just because he went into it with the assumption of all of these things, that these things are a product of the Enlightenment, and you do your history work and you realize that's just not true. So yes, Susan.
Can you say his name again?
Tom Holland. The book is called Dominion.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's not a Christian yet, so you have to filter some stuff out. But yeah,
There is an actor, Tom Holland, but
yeah, not Spider-Man. Yeah, there's also a Tom Holland who was Spider-Man. Apparently, I know less about Spider-Man than I do about church history, but don't get them confused. So Western governments tried to develop constitutions, which was an attempt to work law into these political doctrines, right? And so we have a U.S. Constitution today, right? And a lot of modern governments have constitutions, but constitutional law, a lot of what we have was coming out of the theologians of the Middle Ages. Again, a big point to this is that the man cannot be more important than the office, right? Biden can't be more important than the presidency, right? Trump can't be more important than the presidency. The office, we have to figure out a way of respecting the office, even if there are better people or worse people who are sitting in that seat. And yet, based on biblical truth, the office, it's not that we disregard the office still has to be respected, but it no longer has divine authority, right, to declare to everybody what they ought to do if it's running counter to God's law, right? So this is again a perennial question. We're struggling with this question in America right now. What do you do if the person who sits in the office is an unworthy person of that office, right? How to transition power, how to remove unworthy occupants from the office. And not to say that these things are easy, even in a context of a Christian society, but at least there's laws that are set up that are attempting to make these legal processes rather than just a contest of who has the biggest gun, right? How to have a legitimate transition of rulers. All societies have wrestled with how do we transition, how do we decide who the next ruler is, how do we transition from one ruler to another. The office of the leader matters. We're not allowed to just tear down the office willy-nilly because we feel like it. But can we remove an unworthy ruler without denying the legitimacy of the office? Can we remove a president without saying that the presidency itself needs to be honored and respected as an office? Does that make sense? How do we have transitions of power within society? So, and again, we're coming up on one of these dates this week, right? There has to be a lawful way of transitioning from one ruler to the next, from one person to the next person, right? And these different medieval theologians were working this out. Even prudential questions like, what if you have an unjust leader and he doesn't want to step out of office? At what point is a revolution justified? At what point is it not justified? If a revolution requires a whole lot of people getting killed, maybe we need to be cautious, even if the person in office is unjust. These are things they were trying to work out. Again, under law, because they recognize that we are ultimately under God's law, right? So again, you can see these aren't questions that necessarily have evaporated in modern times. If a bloody revolution, if a whole lot of innocent people get killed, and these are sort of the just law theory too, wrestles with these things, or just war theory, I'm sorry. So this model of living under a legal system, under a constitutional system, this is a product of Christendom. Being under man's law, human governmental law, is legitimate until the true king returns, because we're all, including the king himself, we're all under God's law, right? Thoughts, questions on this? Yeah, Deb.
Isn't it, that French,
Rousseau?
No, de Tocqueville?
Oh, de Tocqueville, yeah.
Yeah, that, he came over to
Mhm.
study our ways of living, our culture,
Mhm.
our society, our government,
Yeah, early 1800s, yep.
Didn't he come to the conclusion that we flourish here in every area of our society because of Christianity?
Right, right.
Versus the way it is in Europe and other countries. The basis of our flourishing in every area is because of that, right?
Right. He was coming from France, which was under a king and under a state church, the state Catholic Church. And he marveled that America did not have state churches in the places that he traveled to, and yet still managed to maintain order and liberty and human thriving. And he wrote some really interesting books about his experience, trying to work out in his mind how this could be true. My favorite political quote is still from T.S. Eliot, who said something like, for all of human history, people have been trying to come up with a political system so perfect that people won't actually have to be good. And there is no political system so perfect that people don't have to be virtuous, right? If you have a critical mass of people in your country who are not virtuous, it does not matter how good your system is, it's not going to work, right? So now we're going to talk a little bit about the shift from these good things to, we're out of time. That's a good time to stop. Any final thoughts? Sorry, that was a lot of theory. If any of this you want to chat about more, feel free to.
My final thought is
Anytime.
I really appreciate your teaching.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Any other comments or thoughts? Go vote Tuesday if you haven't voted already. If you're unsure about some of the referendums, ask somebody who knows. Make sure you're clear on what they are, because they do matter a lot. So,
I think I would just want to drop into the discussion of de Tocqueville and democracy in America and France. That whole, I mean, Tocqueville comes over here after both America and France
gone through
went through
revolution. Yeah.
And the French one went off the rails and ended up being an empire within years.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, it's probably not true in the universities now, but even as recent, yeah, I know some of you can laugh at that, as recent as when I was in college. Okay, even then, you could take a 3-hour course on the French Revolution because colleges understood that there was a foundation of the American Revolution that held it on course. It's not perfect, and I noticed a phrase in your notes today that you're about to get to. But that the French Revolution did not have. If you're going to change power without some authority that you're accountable to above you, it's just power.
It's a free-for-all, yeah.
And the difference shows in those two revolutions, which is why for generations you could study them side by side in colleges.
Well, Tom, would you close us in prayer?